Imagine being at a family gathering, surrounded by the warmth of laughter and conversation, yet feeling like you're in a room that's miles away. You sit there, quiet, watching everyone else talk, joke, and connect. You long to join in, to say something meaningful, but every time you do, the energy shifts. The room doesn't just go silent, it stiffens subtly. You hear your sister get praised for her stories, your brother for his achievements, while your words feel like a disruption, as if your very presence is an inconvenience. It's not always overt hostility. No one shouts at you, no one says, "We don't want you here." But the rejection is there, in the way your words are met with indifference, the way your presence is acknowledged only with a sigh. You're not actively hated, but there's a certain coldness that wraps around you, one that makes you feel invisible, like an outsider in your own home. This is the silent reality of the hated child. Not hated in loud, obvious ways, but hated in the quiet, subtle shifts in the atmosphere. It's the weight of emotional neglect, the quiet dismissal that sinks deep into the soul. And here's the truth. For many, this isn't just a story from childhood. It's a memory that follows them into adulthood. The pain hidden in those small, unnoticed moments shapes everything they feel about themselves. The most devastating part? Often the hated child doesn't even realize they're hated. They see their parents as their entire world, and so when love is withheld, they believe it's them who is unworthy. This isn't just a feeling of being unloved, it becomes the core belief that they are fundamentally unworthy of love. And that belief, like an invisible scar, shapes every relationship, every step they take as they grow. The question we need to ask is, how does this quiet rejection turn into an identity? How does a child who feels unwanted, unnoticed, learn to believe that love is something they have to earn, rather than something that's naturally theirs to receive? And most importantly, how can that story be rewritten? A child's heart is born open, fragile, and hungry for love. They come into the world not with walls, but with an innate need to connect, to feel safe, and to belong. They are not born with the capacity for self-doubt or self-judgment. They are born trusting, believing that the love they need is a basic right, a natural part of being. But when that love is withheld, or worse, replaced by resentment, neglect, or indifference, something begins to change inside them. They don't just feel unloved, they begin to feel unworthy of love. This shift, though subtle, is profound. Unloved is a condition. It's a state of being, a feeling that can arise from circumstances, actions, or lack of care. When a child feels unloved, they might understand, on some level, that it's an external circumstance. I'm not being treated well, but I know I am capable of love. It's an issue that exists in the world outside of them. They can still hold on to the belief that love is something they deserve, something they should receive, even if it's not being given to them in that moment. But unworthy is an identity. It goes far deeper than feeling unloved. It's the toxic internalization of that lack of love. The child believes that the reason they aren't loved is because they're not lovable. They don't see the absence of love as a result of others' flaws or circumstances. Instead, they see themselves as the problem. When a child feels unworthy, it's not just their heart that feels empty. Their very sense of self is shattered. They don't simply long for love, they doubt their right to receive it. This difference is everything. When a child feels unloved, they might still believe that love is possible, that it's something to be earned or restored. But when they feel unworthy, love feels like a distant, unreachable concept. It becomes a privilege others get to experience, not a right they can claim. They start to believe that their inherent worth is not just being ignored, it's being actively rejected. And once that belief is planted, it festers deep within, growing into something that defines every future interaction. The thing is, children don't know how to explain what's happening when they're treated this way. They don't understand the complexities of human relationships, the flaws and imperfections of the people around them. All they know is the coldness they feel, the absence of warmth, the subtle rejection that greets them in everyday moments. And because they are so young, because they look to their parents and caregivers as the ultimate source of love and safety, they don't question that their feelings of rejection have something to do with them. They protect the bond they have with their caregivers, and to do so, they twist the narrative. They make it about themselves. If I am not loved, it must be because I am unlovable. This is the heartbreaking truth about the hated child. They don't just learn that love is something they lack. They learn that they are undeserving of it. Their mind becomes a filter, one that distorts every interaction, making them question their worth with every slight, every criticism, every moment they feel unseen. When they are ignored, it's not just a painful experience, it's evidence that they were right all along. They are not worthy of attention, of affection, of acceptance. Over time, this belief becomes their foundation. They carry it with them into every relationship, every friendship, every love they experience. They live with a quiet ache, never fully feeling like they belong, never fully able to trust that someone could love them for who they truly are. They might achieve success, receive affection, even get praise, but in the deep recesses of their mind, they still hear the whisper, "You are unworthy." And that in many ways becomes their silent battle. Even when they are surrounded by people who care for them, even when they have everything that should reassure them of their worth, they struggle to accept it. Their heart, scarred by years of unspoken rejection, never fully believes in the love they receive. It feels too foreign, too hard to accept. This belief that love is something they must earn, that they must prove their worth through accomplishments or through pleasing others, becomes a lifelong quest, an endless cycle of trying to fill the empty spaces inside them, trying to gain the validation they never received. It becomes the root of their anxiety, their self-doubt, and their inability to trust that they are enough as they are. The tragic part is that many of them don't realize how much this belief, that they are unworthy of love, shapes their lives. They spend their years seeking approval, looking for signs that they are valued, but all the while, they remain trapped in the cycle of not feeling like they deserve love in the first place. And this, more than anything, is what makes healing so difficult. It's not just about being unloved, it's about feeling unworthy of love. And that belief, once formed, takes years of self-compassion, self-awareness, and intentional healing to break. Imagine walking through life with a pair of glasses that distort everything you see. No matter how clear the world might be, these lenses add a layer of distortion, a tint that makes everything appear darker than it really is. For the hated child, this is the reality of how they perceive the world and their relationships, a perception forever shaped by early rejection. The lens through which they view social interactions, connection, and love is tainted by the deep scars of being unloved, unseen, or unwanted as a child. This distortion doesn't just disappear when they grow up. In fact, it becomes deeply embedded in their psyche, influencing how they interpret every gesture, every comment, every glance. The hated child grows into an adult who is hyper-aware of rejection, often seeing it even when it doesn't exist. A casual change in tone, a delayed text reply, a brief moment of silence in conversation. To them, these small events can feel like confirmation of the very thing they fear most, that they are unwanted. Their nervous system is constantly on high alert, scanning the world for signs of emotional abandonment. They've been conditioned to expect rejection, and so they seek it out, even when it's not there. The result? An endless loop of anxiety, self-doubt, and insecurity. Every social interaction, no matter how benign, is filtered through this lens of perceived rejection. A teacher's offhand comment, a friend's distant mood, or a partner's bad day can be interpreted as a personal failure, as evidence that the child's worst fears are true. I am not wanted. I am not enough. This overreaction to perceived rejection isn't something they consciously choose. It's a survival mechanism, one that was forged in the crucible of childhood emotional neglect. The brain, taught to expect emotional pain, reacts by preparing for it, even when it's not coming. This constant scanning for rejection can wear a person down. It creates a sense of emotional fatigue because they're always on edge, always second-guessing every interaction. They struggle to trust others, convinced that any moment of disconnection is the beginning of an inevitable rejection. It's as if their entire sense of self is built on a fragile house of cards, and every slight or misunderstanding threatens to knock it all down. But because their fear is rooted in a deeply internalized belief that they are unworthy of love, they struggle to form meaningful connections. They doubt their own worthiness, and that doubt becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. The more they expect rejection, the more they inadvertently push others away, creating the very isolation they fear. Even more damaging is how this pattern plays out in intimate relationships. The hated child, now an adult, might unknowingly choose partners who mirror the rejection they experienced as children. They might gravitate toward emotionally unavailable or critical individuals because on some subconscious level, this dynamic feels familiar. Their mind has been trained to expect rejection, so when it comes, it's not a surprise. It's a twisted form of comfort. They don't choose it intentionally, they just seek out what their brain has taught them is normal. And so the cycle continues. The deeper the wound, the more deeply it shapes their view of others and themselves. This isn't just about romantic relationships either. Friendships, professional connections, and even casual acquaintances can be affected by this lens of perceived rejection. The hated child might find themselves overcompensating in friendships, trying too hard to gain approval, or distancing themselves from people they fear will eventually leave them. They're always waiting for the other shoe to drop, and in doing so, they miss the opportunity to form healthy, reciprocal relationships where they can feel truly seen and valued. But it's not just the lens of rejection that distorts their view of the world. There's also the deep-seated belief that their feelings, their emotions, are secondary, that their needs don't matter as much as the needs of others. This belief was formed in childhood, when their desires went unnoticed, when their voice was ignored, and when their presence was treated as an inconvenience. The hated child grows into adulthood, carrying this narrative that their emotions are less important, that they must shrink themselves in order to fit into the world around them. This leads to the suppression of their true needs and desires, making it even harder for them to express themselves authentically. This warped lens affects their ability to trust their own perceptions. They might question their memories, wondering if they are overreacting or misinterpreting situations. If others are distant or unresponsive, they may convince themselves that they are the problem, that their very existence is too much for others to handle. The harshness they grew up with becomes internalized as self-criticism, and their inner voice becomes a constant barrage of self-doubt and shame. But here's the turning point. Understanding that this lens, while deeply ingrained, is not permanent. The hated child's perception of rejection can be rewired with intention and healing. The first step is recognizing the pattern, acknowledging that the way they view the world isn't the whole truth, but a distortion caused by years of emotional neglect. Once they begin to see these patterns, they can start to challenge the beliefs that have been built over time. They can learn to question the assumptions they've made about themselves, their worth, and their relationships. Therapy, self-reflection, and intentional, compassionate relationships are key in this process. The more the hated child experiences safe, loving interactions with others, the more their brain begins to form new neural pathways, ones that are not rooted in fear but in trust. Slowly, they learn that not every silence is rejection, and not every criticism is a reflection of their unworthiness. They start to feel safe enough to trust again, to believe that connection is possible without the constant fear of being abandoned. The most important shift, however, is in how they see themselves. They must learn to unlearn the belief that their presence is a disruption or that their emotions are an inconvenience. They must come to understand that they have a right to occupy space, to be heard, to be loved, not because of what they do or how they perform, but simply because they exist. In the end, the hated child's journey is about reclaiming their self-worth. It's about seeing the distortions, feeling the truth beneath them, and learning to trust that love and connection are not things to be earned, but things that are their birthright. The cruelest form of rejection for the hated child often comes in the form of comparison. In a household where love is unevenly distributed, where some children receive warmth and affirmation, while others are met with coldness or indifference, the hated child sees, feels, and internalizes this imbalance. They watch helplessly as their siblings are praised, celebrated, and encouraged for their achievements and qualities. Their sister's laugh is met with smiles, their brother's successes are greeted with pride. But when they speak, when they try to share their own little victories, there is no smile, no encouragement, no recognition. Instead, the tone changes, ever so slightly, but enough to make them feel like a disruption, an unwelcome presence in a space that should feel like home. This comparison, this uneven distribution of love and attention is a wound that the hated child carries for life. They learn very early on that they are not like the others. Their worth isn't celebrated in the same way. They become acutely aware of the favoritism, even if it's not spoken aloud. They feel it in the subtle differences, the warmth in the way their siblings are greeted, the gentleness in their parents' voices when they praise others, and the indifference or silence that greets them when they do the same. The impact of this comparison is devastating. The child begins to internalize a belief that their needs are less important, their achievements less worthy of celebration, and their presence less valued. They don't just feel left out, they feel wrong. They feel as though something is fundamentally flawed in them, as if their very essence is not worthy of love and affection. This belief becomes a constant undercurrent, a low hum that follows them through every social interaction, every relationship. It shapes the way they view themselves and the way they expect the world to treat them. This comparison isn't just a matter of feeling unloved. It is the deep sense of emotional scarcity that permeates the child's experience. In a family where emotional resources are unevenly distributed, the hated child learns to believe that they have to compete for love. They begin to see love as something scarce, something that has to be earned, something they must fight for. They are conditioned to believe that only the loudest, the most visible, the most compliant children get the attention and affection they need. The quiet, the introspective, the ones who struggle to be seen are left to fend for themselves in a world that rewards extroversion and outward performance. Over time, this scarcity mentality becomes ingrained. The child, now an adult, finds it difficult to trust that they will ever receive the love and affirmation they need. They seek out relationships that are similarly emotionally scarce, partners who are distant, friends who are emotionally unavailable, situations where they feel they must constantly prove their worth to be seen. They are drawn to what feels familiar, even if it isn't healthy. The dynamic of emotional scarcity has become so deeply embedded in their psyche that they don't even realize they are recreating it. They may even feel comforted by the distance, the emotional withholding, because it's what they have known their whole life. It's what feels safe. But here's the tragedy of it all. This scarcity mindset, learned so early on, distorts the reality of how love and affection should be given. It makes the adult believe that love is a finite resource, something that has to be competed for or earned through constant performance. It keeps them in a cycle of overachievement, people-pleasing, and self-sacrifice, all in the hopes of securing the love that they've always felt was just out of reach. And yet, no matter how much they achieve, how much they give, they never feel enough. The cycle repeats, with their sense of unworthiness driving them to overcompensate, in ways that drain them emotionally. This comparison also affects how the hated child navigates the world outside the family. They carry the belief that they are less deserving than others, that their needs don't matter as much, and that they must fight for any space they occupy. This is why the hated child, now an adult, often struggles with assertiveness. They struggle to claim their right to be heard, to ask for what they need, because they've internalized the belief that they are less deserving than others. They shrink themselves in social situations, quietly doubting that their presence adds anything of value. They may feel like an imposter in relationships, unsure whether they truly belong, and constantly questioning if they are loved for who they are or for what they do. But there's another layer to this, a deeper truth that the hated child must eventually learn. They were never the problem. The scarcity they feel was never about their inherent value, but about the environment they were raised in. The love they lacked was not a reflection of their worth, it was a reflection of the limitations of the people around them. The first step in breaking free from this comparison is understanding the origin of the belief. It's recognizing that the emotional scarcity they feel is not a universal truth, but a distortion shaped by childhood experiences. The second step is learning to break the cycle of competition for love. The adult who was once the hated child must start by giving themselves the love and validation they've always sought from others. They must learn to see themselves as worthy of affection and acceptance, not because of what they can give, but because of who they are. The key is to stop measuring their worth by how others perceive them, by how much praise they receive, or by how loudly they can make their voice heard. They must begin to understand that their worth is not determined by external validation, but by their inherent humanity. They are worthy of love because they exist, not because they meet certain standards or expectations. This shift takes time and patience. It requires self-compassion, the ability to treat themselves with the same kindness and care they would give to a loved one. It means challenging the old narrative that they are unworthy and replacing it with a new story, one that says, "I am enough as I am." This new narrative isn't just about affirmations, it's about healing the wounds of comparison, releasing the false belief in emotional scarcity, and embracing the truth that love is abundant, not limited. The hated child, once they understand this, can break free from the grip of comparison. They can step into a space where they no longer feel the need to compete for love or approval. They can begin to build relationships that are based on mutual respect and genuine connection, rather than the transactional need for validation. And in doing so, they stop seeing love as a scarce resource to be earned and start experiencing it as the abundant, unconditional gift it is meant to be. Imagine living your life constantly trying to prove your worth, as though every action, every word, every thought had to justify your right to exist, to take up space, to be loved. For the hated child, this isn't a metaphor, it's their reality. The rejection they experienced, whether overt or subtle, becomes an internal wound that they spend their entire life trying to heal, often without even realizing the root cause of their pain. But here's the truth. They don't heal the wound by addressing the root. Instead, they compensate for it. They wear masks, adopting survival strategies that they mistakenly believe are their true selves. Some become perfectionists, driven by the belief that if they can just be flawless enough, they will finally earn the love that was denied to them. They excel in every area of life, constantly striving for the unattainable, hoping that their achievements will fill the emotional void left by their childhood rejection. But no matter how many accolades they receive, how many times they succeed, it never feels like enough. Perfection, after all, is a mask. It's a way of hiding the fear that underneath it all, they are still the same child who was never seen, never valued, never embraced for who they truly are. Others become people pleasers, moulding themselves into whatever shape they believe will gain approval. They bend and twist to meet the expectations of others, willing to sacrifice their own needs, their own desires, in order to keep the peace to avoid rejection. They convince themselves that if they just make everyone else happy, they will finally feel safe, finally feel loved. But deep down, they know that their love is conditional. They are only loved for what they can give, for what they do, not for who they are. The people pleaser's mask is built on the belief that love is something they must earn by serving others, by being endlessly accommodating. And though they may find acceptance in the short term, it's never truly fulfilling because it's not rooted in authenticity. Then there are those who adopt rebellion as their armor, pushing people away before they can be pushed first. For them, rejection feels like an inevitable fate, something they can't avoid. So they rebel. They shut people out, create walls, keep everyone at a distance. The idea is simple. If no one gets too close, no one can hurt them. But while rebellion may offer temporary protection, it doesn't heal the underlying wound. It only isolates them further, creating a barrier between them and the love they long for, even if they don't realize it. The rebel's mask is built on the belief that it's safer to be disliked, to push others away, than to risk being rejected once again. What's important to understand is that none of these strategies, perfection, people-pleasing, rebellion, are truly who the hated child is. They are not identities, but survival mechanisms, ways of coping with the deep, hidden pain of rejection. They are the child's attempt to navigate a world that feels unsafe, a world that doesn't value them for who they are. They believe that by wearing these masks, they can protect themselves, earn love, and finally be seen. But the tragedy is that over time, the hated child forgets the difference between the mask and the self. The mask becomes who they think they are. They become so attached to their perfectionism, their people-pleasing tendencies, or their rebellious attitudes that they begin to think that these are their true selves, when in reality, they are just defensive responses to a wound that was never allowed to heal. This is why so many adults, once they leave their childhood home, continue to struggle with the same patterns of behaviour. They carry these masks into their relationships, their careers, and their daily lives, unable to break free from the false identity they've created. But here's the breakthrough. These masks, while they served a purpose in childhood, do not define them. The perfectionist isn't just a person who strives for excellence. They are someone who is terrified of not being good enough. The people pleaser isn't someone who enjoys making everyone happy. They are someone who has learned that love only comes when they meet others' needs at the expense of their own. The rebel isn't someone who enjoys defiance. They are someone who has learned that keeping people at arm's length is the only way to protect themselves from further hurt. The process of healing begins when the hated child recognizes these masks for what they are. Survival mechanisms that were necessary at one point, but are no longer serving them. The first step is to separate the mask from the self, to see that who they are underneath the perfectionism, the people-pleasing, or the rebellion is enough. They were worthy of love and acceptance all along, not because of what they did or didn't do, but simply because they existed. The second step is learning to take off the mask, to start showing up as themselves, even if it feels uncomfortable, even if it feels risky. This isn't about changing overnight or throwing away old habits all at once. It's about small, intentional acts of self-expression. It's about choosing to speak up when they would have remained silent. It's about allowing themselves to fail without the fear of rejection. It's about finally letting go of the belief that their worth is tied to what they can do or give to others. Over time, as the hated child begins to shed their masks, they start to reconnect with their true self. The one that was always worthy, always enough, always deserving of love. And though the process is slow, though it may require therapy, self-reflection, and healing relationships, the journey toward authenticity is a journey toward freedom. It's the freedom to live life without the constant need to prove their worth, the freedom to be seen for who they truly are, and the freedom to love themselves without conditions. In the quiet corners, of the hated child's world, there is a wound that often goes unnoticed. It's the pain they cannot speak about, the hurt they cannot express. This is the hidden wound of unspoken pain, one that is shaped by years of emotional neglect, rejection, and invalidation. For many children who grow up feeling unloved or unwanted, there is a deep silence that surrounds their emotional world. The pain of being overlooked, dismissed, or treated as an inconvenience is not always loud or obvious. It isn't the kind of pain that leaves visible scars, but it is real and it is profound. The hated child learns, early on, that their feelings are secondary. They learn that speaking about their hurt is dangerous, that their pain will only invite criticism, dismissal, or further rejection. Instead of expressing themselves, they internalize the hurt. They swallow it, keep it hidden, and present a face that says, "I'm fine," even when they're not. This pattern becomes ingrained over time. The child, now an adult, doesn't talk about the pain they carry because they don't believe anyone will listen. They fear that to reveal their emotional wounds will only confirm the unspoken belief that they are a burden, that their pain is something to be ignored or ridiculed. This silence, this refusal to speak about their pain, becomes a coping mechanism. It is a way of surviving in an environment where their emotions were never validated. But while it may offer short-term relief, it comes at a heavy cost. Unspoken pain does not vanish. It doesn't go away because it's ignored. Instead, it festers. It hides in the corners of the mind, in the quiet moments when the distractions of life fade away. It seeps into their body, becoming a kind of low-level, chronic emotional stress that affects everything from self-esteem to physical health. It shapes choices, relationships, and even the way they view themselves. The longer the hated child remains silent about their pain, the more deeply it affects them. They may become experts at hiding their emotions, but the toll it takes on their mental health can be immense. Studies in psychology have shown that emotional repression, the act of bottling up feelings instead of expressing them, is linked to higher rates of depression, anxiety, and emotional instability. The silent suffering of the hated child can lead to a lifetime of self-doubt, a sense of being broken, or a constant feeling of being unworthy of love or care. But there's something even more insidious at play here, the belief that their pain doesn't matter. Because they were never given the space to express their hurt, they come to internalize the idea that their feelings aren't important. Over time, this belief morphs into a self-fulfilling prophecy. They may avoid situations where they might need help, thinking that no one will truly care. They may refuse to ask for support because they don't believe they deserve it. They might choose partners, friends, or jobs where their needs are overlooked or dismissed, because on some subconscious level, this feels normal. This is what they have known all their life. Their silence then becomes a barrier between them and the connection they crave. But it doesn't stop there. The long-term effects of unspoken pain can spill over into every area of the hated child's life. The deep-seated belief that their feelings are not worthy of attention makes it difficult for them to communicate effectively in relationships. They may have a hard time articulating what they need from a partner, a friend, or even a therapist. They may struggle with boundaries, thinking that it's selfish to assert their needs or desires. They may become people pleasers or perfectionists, compensating for their feelings of inadequacy by overachieving or trying to make everyone else happy, hoping that by doing so, they will finally feel valued. But this only leads to more exhaustion, more internal frustration, and more emotional disconnect. The body, too, bears the weight of this unspoken pain. Chronic stress, the kind caused by emotional suppression, can lead to physical ailments such as headaches, digestive issues, sleep problems, and even heart disease. It's as though the body is carrying the burden of the unsaid, the things that were never allowed to be expressed. And while the person may learn to manage these physical symptoms over time, they never truly heal the underlying emotional wounds. This is where the healing process begins. Naming the pain is the first step. When the hated child, now an adult, starts to speak their truth, to name the experiences they endured, something incredible happens. The weight of the silence begins to lift. It's not an immediate cure, but it's the beginning of a powerful shift. Naming the experience, acknowledging that they grew up feeling unloved, unseen, unwanted, allows them to move from the realm of internalized shame and guilt to a space of self-compassion and understanding. Psychological studies on trauma have shown that simply putting experiences into words can dramatically reduce their emotional intensity. The act of naming helps bring order to chaos. It turns the vague ache, the gnawing feeling of being broken, into something concrete, something that can be understood and processed. It's a profound step toward healing because it allows the hated child to see their experiences not as a reflection of their worth, but as events that happened to them, things that they had no control over. And in that realization, there is freedom. The next step is reparenting. Reparenting is the process of offering yourself the care and compassion that you never received as a child. It's about treating yourself with the kindness, love, and patience you always needed, but were denied. It's about speaking to yourself as you would speak to a hurt child, with empathy, gentleness, and validation. This is not about excusing the past or denying the hurt. It's about healing those old wounds by offering yourself the care you should have received all along. Over time, the hated child begins to rewrite their story. They start to see that the pain they carried for so long was not a reflection of their worth, but a wound that needs healing. They start to understand that silence doesn't make the pain go away, it only prolongs the suffering. And as they begin to speak their truth, whether through therapy, art, writing, or simply sharing with someone they trust, they start to reclaim the power that was once lost in that silence. For the hated child, rejection doesn't just affect how they relate to others, it fundamentally alters how they relate to themselves. This is the danger of internalized rejection. It's the painful process by which the child begins to see their lack of love as a reflection of their own inherent worth. It's not just that they feel unloved, they believe they are unworthy of love. Rejection, when it happens repeatedly, doesn't just become a moment of emotional pain. It becomes a truth that shapes the child's entire identity. And as they grow, this deep-seated belief can weave itself into every area of their life, dictating their choices, relationships, and self-perception. The impact of internalized rejection is profound. It starts early, when the child first notices that they are treated differently from their siblings, or that their presence seems to cause discomfort rather than joy. The child's fragile mind doesn't have the capacity to see this as a flaw in the caregivers. Instead, it makes an unconscious, self-protective conclusion. I must be the problem. The child doesn't have the tools to process emotional neglect, so they turn inward and start to assume that they are somehow defective, that their mere existence is too much or too little for the people around them. This internalization of rejection becomes a deeply embedded belief system. The child grows up with a constant, gnawing sense that they don't quite belong, that they are somehow fundamentally flawed. They might succeed in life, achieve outwardly, and gain recognition in certain areas, but there's always a quiet ache underneath. They never quite feel enough. They constantly question their worth and struggle with self-doubt. Even when they receive love, they have trouble trusting it, because it doesn't align with the belief they've carried all their life. I am not worthy of love. This narrative can be incredibly dangerous because it's not just a fleeting thought, it becomes an identity. The hated child learns to define themselves by the rejection they've experienced. They internalize the pain to such an extent that it becomes part of their self-concept, defining how they see themselves and how they believe others see them. They might walk through life feeling like an imposter, constantly fearing that others will discover what they believe is the truth about themselves, that they are broken, that they are unworthy of the care and affection they long for. Over time, the cycle of self-rejection becomes deeply entrenched. They seek validation from others because they've never been able to validate themselves. They seek love from relationships because they've never been able to give that love to themselves. They become people pleasers, overachievers, or rebels, anything to prove their worth, anything to earn love. But because this love is sought from external sources, it never feels quite fulfilling. No matter how much they achieve or how much they give, they always feel like they're running a race they can never quite win. The sense of unworthiness continues to echo inside them, making it impossible to truly feel at peace. Healing requires forgiveness, not of the people who rejected them, though that may come later, but of themselves. Forgiving themselves for believing they were unworthy, for internalizing the rejection, and for allowing those beliefs to define their actions and relationships. This is not an easy process, but it is essential for breaking free from the cycle of internalized rejection. The final step in healing is rebuilding trust, trusting themselves, trusting others, and trusting that they are worthy of love and connection. They begin to surround themselves with people who see them for who they truly are, not for their performance, not for what they can give, but for their inherent worth. Slowly, they begin to trust that love is not something to be earned, but something they are always worthy of receiving. The gift of healing from internalized rejection is that the individual begins to feel a sense of belonging, not just to others, but to themselves. They learn that they are enough, just as they are. They no longer need to prove their worth through achievement, perfection, or people-pleasing. They can simply exist and be loved. They can step into relationships without fear of abandonment. They can speak their truth without fear of rejection. And they can live their lives with the knowledge that they are worthy of love, not because of what they do, but because of who they are. For the hated child, the journey from rejection to resilience is not easy, but it is possible. Rejection, when faced and processed, can become a source of unexpected strength. The paradox is that the very thing that once broke them can also become the foundation of something remarkable: empathy, resilience, and depth. When the hated child learns to navigate their pain, they transform the wounds of their past into powerful tools for growth. At its core, empathy is a response born from experiencing emotional hardship. Those who have known rejection intimately are often the ones who can understand it in others. The child who is unloved becomes keenly attuned to the emotions of those around them, able to sense when someone is hurting, when someone is vulnerable, when someone feels unseen. Their sensitivity, once a source of pain, becomes a remarkable strength. This heightened awareness allows them to offer support to others in ways that few can. They know the sting of silence, the ache of being ignored, the confusion of feeling invisible, and as a result, they learn to hold space for others' pain in a way that feels deeply authentic. For the hated child, this empathy often becomes the bedrock of their relationships. They don't just listen to others, they truly hear them. They can sense the unspoken words, the hidden fears, the internal struggles that people are too afraid to say out loud. In this way, they can offer a kind of healing to those around them, because they have learned what it means to be wounded and, in turn, how to heal. This empathy doesn't just make them good friends or partners, it makes them great leaders, counselors, and artists, anyone whose work is driven by a deep understanding of the human condition. However, resilience is perhaps the most profound gift that the hated child can cultivate from their past. It's easy to assume that resilience is about bouncing back from hardship, but true resilience is more than just surviving pain. It is the ability to take that pain and transform it into something meaningful. For the hated child, resilience often means carrying the weight of their past without allowing it to define their future. It means finding a way to move forward, even when the world has told them they were unworthy, unlovable, or broken. This resilience is not just about enduring, it's about thriving despite the rejection. It's about using the lessons learned in the darkness of their childhood to shine a light for others. It's about taking the rejection they've faced and turning it into a source of personal strength. Their ability to withstand emotional hardship becomes a powerful force that drives them to achieve great things, not out of a need to prove themselves, but because they have discovered the profound depths of their own strength. They understand what it means to fall and rise again, and they bring this resilience to every aspect of their lives, whether in personal relationships, careers, or creative pursuits. One of the most profound ways this resilience manifests is through creativity. Many artists, writers, musicians, and thinkers who have experienced rejection in their youth go on to create works of stunning depth and beauty. Their art becomes the language through which they process their pain, their rejection, and their longing for belonging. What was once a source of internal turmoil becomes an outward expression of their humanity. They channel their experiences into something that not only helps them heal, but also helps others see the world in new ways. The transformation from pain to purpose isn't always smooth, and it certainly doesn't happen overnight. It requires time, patience, and a deep commitment to healing. It requires self-compassion, learning to treat oneself with the kindness and care that was denied in childhood. It requires acceptance of one's past without letting it dictate the future. But over time, the hated child learns to see their emotional wounds, not as a mark of weakness, but as a source of power. They come to realize that their rejection didn't diminish them. It gave them a unique ability to understand others, to be resilient in the face of adversity, and to create beauty out of brokenness. But the greatest strength the hated child can gain is the freedom to choose who they become. Rejection, while a painful part of their past, does not have to define their future. They can choose to rewrite their story, to reject the narratives that were imposed upon them by others, and to embrace the truth that they are worthy of love, belonging, and success. Not because they earned it, but because they exist. There's an incredible truth hidden within this process of healing. The hated child can become the person they needed as a child. They can become a source of comfort, empathy, and strength for others who feel unseen or unheard. They can transform their pain into something beautiful, into something that not only heals them, but heals the world around them. They can teach others how to love themselves, how to embrace their flaws, and how to see their own worth. Ultimately, the transformation from being the hated child to becoming a resilient, empathetic, and creative adult is a process of reclaiming their power. They learn that they are not defined by their past rejection, but by the strength they gain from overcoming it. The hated child's greatest gift is their ability to rise, not despite their rejection, but because of it. Their journey from pain to purpose is a reminder that even the most painful experiences can be transformed into sources of strength, empathy, and resilience. For the hated child, the journey toward healing is not just about understanding their pain or transforming their wounds into strengths. It's about the difficult, paradoxical act of being seen. The very thing that was missing in their childhood, the recognition of their worth, the acknowledgement of their emotions, is also the very thing they must reclaim as adults. To heal, they must learn to be seen for who they truly are, and this requires a level of vulnerability that can be deeply uncomfortable. Being seen, truly seen, is not as simple as being noticed. It's not about standing in front of a crowd and demanding attention. It's about being understood for who you are, beyond the masks you wear, beyond the survival mechanisms you've built. It's about showing the world, and most importantly, yourself, that you are worthy of love, compassion, and connection, just as you are, flaws, scars, and all. The paradox is this: the hated child who spent their childhood trying to hide, trying to become invisible to avoid rejection, now must allow themselves to be visible, to be vulnerable in order to heal. For many, this feels like a terrifying prospect. Vulnerability, for the hated child, feels like exposure, a risk of being hurt again, a chance that the rejection they once felt will return. But the act of allowing yourself to be seen, truly seen, is where the healing begins. When a person has lived their life hiding their true self, afraid that their flaws will lead to rejection, the idea of being authentic in relationships, whether with friends, romantic partners, or even family, feels unsafe. There is a deep fear of being misunderstood, of being dismissed, of being rejected once again. This fear can cause them to keep parts of themselves hidden, even from those who love them most. They might withhold their needs, their desires, their pain, because they're so used to believing that expressing those things will lead to abandonment. But healing, paradoxically, requires them to do the very thing they've feared most: to let themselves be seen, to let others into their world of hurt and healing. This doesn't mean sharing every emotion or every thought all at once, but it means allowing themselves to be vulnerable in the right relationships, to speak their truth, to express their needs, and to seek connection without the fear that doing so will make them unworthy. In this process, vulnerability becomes a superpower. Vulnerability is not weakness, as many may have been taught. In fact, vulnerability is one of the most courageous things a person can do. To open up and expose your deepest fears, your truest self, requires incredible strength. And for the hated child, this is a power they've spent their whole life trying to avoid. But it is in this power of vulnerability that the hated child can begin to heal. The more they allow themselves to be seen, the more they come to realize that their worth is not determined by what others think of them, but by the love they have for themselves. At first, this process can be agonizing. To be truly seen means confronting the parts of yourself you've long kept hidden. It requires you to face the deep-seated fear that you are unlovable, that you are not enough, and to dismantle those beliefs brick by brick. It means allowing others to see your weaknesses, your insecurities, your mistakes, without fearing that they will use them against you or walk away. It means letting go of the belief that you must be perfect, that you must earn love by hiding your pain or pretending to be something you're not. But when the hated child allows themselves to be seen, they begin to see something remarkable. They are still worthy, still lovable, even without the masks they've worn for so long. They learn that love is not something to be earned by being flawless, but something that is given freely when they allow themselves to be real. And in this process of being seen, they discover that true connection comes not from perfection, but from authenticity. When they show up as their true selves, vulnerable, imperfect, but full of potential, they begin to find relationships that are deeper, more meaningful, and more fulfilling than anything they've experienced before. This also means being seen by themselves. The journey to healing involves not just being seen by others, but coming to see yourself with compassion and understanding. The hated child must learn to embrace their own story, to understand that their past does not define them, and that the pain they've carried for so long can become a source of wisdom and strength. This requires a shift in perspective. Instead of seeing themselves as broken, they must learn to see themselves as a person who has survived, who has endured, and who has the capacity to heal and grow. One of the most transformative aspects of being seen is giving themselves permission to belong to themselves, to others, and to the world. For so long, the hated child has felt like an outsider, someone who doesn't quite fit in. But when they allow themselves to be vulnerable and authentic, they begin to realize that they belong simply by existing. They don't need to prove their worth to anyone. They are worthy because they are human, because they have a heart that beats, because they have a soul that longs for connection. As the hated child learns to allow themselves to be seen, they also begin to attract the kind of relationships they've always deserved. Relationships where they are valued, respected, and loved for who they truly are, not for what they can give or do. They start to find communities where their voice matters, where their presence is welcomed, and where their vulnerability is honoured. These relationships become a safe space for them to practice being seen without fear of rejection, and in doing so, they continue to heal, continue to grow. But perhaps the most profound realization is this: to heal, the hated child must first learn to see themselves when they look at their reflection, not as someone who is broken, but as someone who is worthy of love, someone who has always been enough. They begin the most important part of their healing journey. They learn to see themselves with the same compassion and kindness they have longed for from others, and in that moment, they begin to rewrite their own story. The healing process is a continuous act of self-recognition, recognizing that they are not defined by the rejection of their past, but by the love and acceptance they are now capable of giving themselves. For the hated child, healing is not just about understanding the past or navigating the pain of rejection. It's about creating a new path forward, one where they redefine their sense of self and their place in the world. This transformation doesn't happen by accident. It requires intentional effort, patience, and a commitment to reparenting, the act of becoming the loving, compassionate caregiver to the inner child that was once neglected, rejected, or overlooked. This is the final and most profound step toward healing, because it involves giving the wounded parts of the self the care and attention they always needed but never received. Reparenting means stepping into a new role, not just as an adult who has survived childhood rejection, but as a nurturing, loving figure who can offer themselves the care and affection they were denied in their youth. It's a process of rewriting the story that the hated child has lived by, the story of being unworthy, broken, or unloved, and replacing it with a narrative of self-compassion, self-acceptance, and unconditional love. It's about healing the wounds of the past, not by erasing them, but by offering the parts of themselves that were once neglected the love they needed to flourish. To reparent oneself is to offer kindness and gentleness where there once was harshness. It's learning to speak to yourself the way you would speak to a child in pain, with compassion, understanding, and reassurance. When the hated child begins to practice self-compassion, they shift from an internal dialogue of criticism and self-blame to one of nurturing and care. They start to forgive themselves for the mistakes they made as a result of the pain they carried. They forgive themselves for the times they believed they weren't worthy, and for the times they allowed their pain to define them. Reparenting is the act of choosing to show up for yourself, to be the parent you never had, and to give yourself the love you always deserved. The process of reparenting is not quick, and it's not always easy. It requires confronting difficult emotions, past hurts, and ingrained beliefs that were formed during childhood. But it also offers a profound opportunity for growth and healing. Through reparenting, the hated child, now an adult, begins to reclaim their sense of worth. They stop seeking validation from external sources, and instead, they become the source of their own validation. They learn to trust themselves, to believe in their own value, and to cultivate a deep sense of belonging, not to others, but to themselves. Through reparenting, the adult who once felt unworthy of love begins to learn that they are inherently worthy, regardless of the past. They stop measuring their value by external achievements, people's approval, or the love they didn't receive as a child. Instead, they begin to believe that they are deserving of love because they are human, because they exist, and because they are worthy of care, attention, and respect. This internal shift is what creates lasting change. It transforms the inner child's wounds into sources of wisdom, strength, and compassion. In reparenting themselves, the hated child learns to set boundaries in relationships, to protect their emotional health, and to avoid repeating the harmful patterns of the past. They begin to stop tolerating mistreatment or allowing others to disregard their needs. They learn to value their own presence and to assert their worth, no longer shrinking to make others comfortable. They start building healthier relationships where they feel seen, heard, and valued. Relationships that are based on mutual respect, kindness, and understanding. But reparenting is not only about setting boundaries and demanding respect from others, it's also about creating a new future. The hated child, once steeped in the pain of rejection, now has the opportunity to create a life where love is not earned, but given freely. The path forward is one where they can live authentically, without the constant fear of abandonment, rejection, or inadequacy. They can begin to dream without the chains of the past holding them back. They can finally live a life that reflects their true worth. This new life is about more than just healing from past wounds. It's about thriving despite those wounds. It's about transforming the experience of rejection into something that fuels their growth, that inspires them to be better, to love more deeply, and to create the kind of life they always longed for. Healing through reparenting isn't just about overcoming the past, it's about creating something new, something that is built on love, self-worth, and the deep, abiding belief that they are enough. But the journey doesn't end with the individual. Healing can ripple out. The hated child, now healed, can become a parent, a partner, a friend, a leader who is equipped to offer the same compassion and love that they once needed. They can break the cycle of rejection, offering their children, or the people they care about, the love and emotional safety they themselves were denied. By healing and reparenting themselves, they have the power to heal future generations, to create a new legacy of emotional safety, love, and acceptance. Reparenting also means choosing a different path. The hated child, who once felt like they were doomed to a life of rejection, now has the power to choose a future where they are loved and valued. They can take the lessons from their painful past and apply them to their present and future, choosing love over rejection, compassion over judgment, and healing over harm. They can redefine what it means to belong and create a life that is shaped by love, both the love they give and the love they receive. Ultimately, reparenting offers the hated child a new life. It is the act of giving themselves the love and safety they didn't receive as children. It is about accepting themselves as they are, not as the world has told them they should be. It's about choosing a life that is defined by self-worth, not by the rejection of the past. And in doing so, the hated child, now an adult, becomes the author of their own story, creating a future that is not dictated by the hurts of the past but shaped by the love, compassion, and acceptance they can now offer themselves. Healing begins when the hated child looks at their past with understanding and compassion, then chooses to build a future that reflects their true worth. The path forward is one of transformation, of choosing to belong to themselves, and in turn, creating relationships and communities where they are seen, heard, and valued. The journey from rejection to love is not easy, but it is possible. The hated child can choose to be loved, not because of what they do, but simply because of who they are.